Never mind.
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Frank, for inviting us. I think it's gone to some funny screen share there, Frank. How do we, maybe that's just me, is it? That's just me. So thanks so much for inviting us. And I'll be honest about this, the invite came not that long ago, and I anticipated, you know, a reasonably small and intimate conversation. And so what I thought I'd do is reach out to a few people that I admired, some from a distance and some from past acquaintance, and see if we could have a conversation, one free of institutional projection or of the kind of jobs that we have to do, but that we might actually explore a territory from our unalike positions to do that. And I think that explains, you know, Mark and Nasrine and myself, we each have worked and are continuing to work in schools with quite different territories, quite different contexts. And our hope would be that in this conversation, we open up points of dissonance, but also points where we might actually congrue around certain things. And I think as a kind of an opener, I think it's worth saying, and Nasrine was pointing at it at the start, and so was before we joined this, and so was Mark, that, you know, you send an email to people at relatively short notice, and these are people with important jobs, and they respond positively. And that is interesting in the context of architecture education, because it seems to be predominantly run by people who care, and who care deeply about the subject and about their duties to it. And so that's interesting as a basic context. And I'd like to dwell just for 1 second on the idea of care, which is to observe just some, you know, obvious points, which is that the vast majority of students arrive in a school of architecture with an intention to do some good to the world. And there's a kind of an attitude of care, I suppose, in the intention, and that produces a binding of force in schools of architecture by self-selection, you could say, and it happens elsewhere as well. That is a powerful force, but then they enter a discipline, architecture, which is obviously one that is incredibly contingent, married to capital and to power structures, and difficult to radically reinvent, or at least the opportunity for that are not ones that present themselves freely or easily. And so the context of care becomes one that can frequently move to conversations of anger or of dissonance, which is a kind of a disempowering when care, or the attitude to care or to impart good, becomes disempowered, and that fundamentally is linked to your discipline. I find that compelling as a kind of trajectory in our discipline. It produces a discipline that's really incredibly self-critical, something I like, that's prone to making divisive comments from a distance about the practices or the educational practices of others. And what's really interesting in this context then is the School of Architecture. I mean, obviously an architect's education precedes the School of Architecture and continues for long after, but the school is continually talked about in terms at once both as the solution to the world's ills and potentially as the cause. And there's this sort of interesting pressure that it places on conversations in schools or about schools, which is that the various forces which face an educational context, and they can be ethical and disciplinary, or they can be matters relating to societal change, they become potentially quite fraught in a school, in the sense of the pressures to respond to issues and the pressures to respond and to solve those issues is seen as something possible within a school when it's not seen as possible within the wider discipline. The schools obviously are part of the world that they are surrounded by, and therefore not able to control those situations. And at the same time, that control is sort of implied. And what this produces is that as architecture evolves with its society, and as the pressures that inevitably bear on human culture shape architecture as they inevitably do, and they can be economic or they can be cultural or climatic as now, the pressure is on schools to be to immediately respond to those issues by radical change. Sometimes that's necessary, and sometimes it takes time to work out what the right approach is. And I find this interesting because it produces a kind of a conversation about the subject which is continually compelling and quite critical and quite energizing. It's a place then where the school fosters certain types of practice which aren't possible in the outside context alone. And then it produces a conversation between students and their educators and the wider world, which is complex. And latterly, the conversation has been one about its transition to a service industry, but it's also to do with the university's necessity to empower or to enfranchise people from diverse backgrounds, and its ability to kind of extend the realm of architecture as it should to encompass more and more people. And those efforts and the sincere efforts to do so produce some really heightened moments in schools. So I'll stop blathering on, but that's the context of education for me and why the school remains a continually fascinating place. And I'm joined by two people obviously far more esteemed than me and with much better things to say about this, Mark and Nasrine. And I might, Nasrine, just hand to you to maybe describe the territory as you see it of this conversation. And then once we've gone through, the three of us, we might start to pick apart moments that we might want to interrogate more deeply.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you for inviting me to this discussion, or whatever we call it these days. We can't even call it a Zoom roundtable. Maybe we call it a Zoom interface discussion group. It's very interesting, this notion of care that you brought up, because we were talking about it earlier, and I had probably formulated it for myself as this idea of fraternity in architecture, as there is a lack of sorority anyway, everywhere in the world, and fraternity seems to be the only word that people understand these days. But I think that the fact that the three of us over a period of 2 days came to agree upon sharing the one thing that we all sort of commonly have an interest, and very much of an interest in, and that is architecture and its education, proves that there is there is a continuous sort of not only passion, but there's a continuous thought-provoking intellectual basis for all of us to that are engaged in teaching, but also in practice, to sort of carry on with. As you had mentioned, and as we talked about it earlier on, there are a series of things that I thought that we could discuss, which of course sort of put the question of architecture schools. I would very much like to talk about specificity of architecture schools, because we tend to, and as you said in your introductory remarks, we tend to sort of turn everything into a global idea of sort of softening one line about architecture and architecture schools, whereas American schools are about very different things than European schools. Their financing, their management, their relationship to the public, their relationship to practice are very, very different. So it would be good for us, I think, that if we could at some point in the discussion talk about specificity of architecture schools and how that actually has any kind of relevance to the way that architecture students and architecture teachers create possibilities of making the discipline to go forward. We did say that, yes, we're not going to talk about ranking, as none of our schools are ranked anywhere, even though Kingston is apparently ranked 110. I don't know what UCD is ranked for. We wouldn't be ranked because it's not a university. However, I think that one thing that interests me in that is not so much a ranking of universities, but it's the fact that I would like to suggest that one of the things that is quite important for us to think about in architectural education is the notion of network as opposed to the notion of competition. Ranking basically is a system of competition, whereas I think that architecture schools in this part of the 21st century and in the near future need to look at themselves as networks as opposed to competitors, and therefore ranking, we could probably just throw it out. The other thing that I would think that would be interesting for us to talk about would be the relationship of research in architecture and in schools and in universities, because it still is quite a sort of painful, I think, issue when it comes to the scientific sort of idea of what research is and what research holds, and how one can actually introduce the thinking of the discipline of architecture, and therefore the sort of design as a way of doing research as well. So design in research, yes, but research by design is still quite fresh, even though Bartlett and many other universities have sort of coined it and have turned these to be parts of the research that architects deal with in their respective schools. Then perhaps we could at some point talk about teaching architecture, and teaching architecture obviously has one basis to it, and that is curriculum. And as Mark mentioned it in our talk beforehand, I think that it would be extremely important for us, for all of us, to talk about the curriculum and what does that mean today in this part of the century. All of these will, of course, at some point in the discussion, hopefully, come to how we finance our schools, what the question of financing means, what are the models that we're thinking about, because the consequence of that is the way that we lead schools, we direct schools, we manage schools, and therefore the question of the way that the community of the school actually is led becomes quite important. It's not only through the financing, it's also through the various lines that I'm trying to bring into the discussion. I'll leave it at that, and then we'll come into any of these topics that interest our audience and ourselves to carry on.
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, that's a really nice territory, you know, the specificity of a school, the kind of the school as a network potentially, the idea then about research and the contestation of research links to curriculum in some ways, and maybe that we might return to that. And Mark, I might just hand to you to let you take over and maybe describe the areas that you'd like us to engage with this evening.
Well, thanks, Andrew, and again, thank you for inviting me. It's quite an indulgent thing, this boutique discussion. I'm looking forward. I think a lot of Nasrine's points I intersect with. I think this point of care is interesting. The AA, even if your permanent staff reissues your contract every year, which is slightly disconcerting. And I reread in my contract at the top end of my role description, pastoral care, which coming from the States was a new idea, pastoral care. And it's become a sort of centerpiece of my life at the Architectural Association. It is about care in the trenches and looking after students and student experience, also caring for staff. Pastoral care links up to mental health issues and a lot of things that have come up in the last 2 years around COVID. So if I have 3 C's, one is around care, I suppose. One, what lessons have we learned coming out of teaching online for the better part of 2 years and now teaching face-to-face this academic year? And how have those lessons impacted curriculum, which is my last C. Particularly, I'd like to talk at some point this evening about the status of my world where I teach in history and theory studies. I think a lot of this debate and discussion around the future or need for architectural history. I've spent the better part of my day leading a history seminar. And I'm really curious where Nasrine and Andrew want to input on how history is being dealt with within their programs. But I think around care, curriculum, and COVID, we'll explore a lot. But I want to come back to this notion of fraternity. It's certainly the case that when Andrew sends out an email, it doesn't need to be 8 weeks in advance. I think you jump because ultimately we're a very small community. And the opportunity to discuss things without all the limitations Andrew described is quite exceptional. So I think it's something that we should acknowledge as an abiding strength of the discipline of architecture, actually. It seems to be more than a Masonic handshake. it's a real understanding of the travails and the opportunities of a discipline that connects people and makes them want to jump right in and say yes every time. So I believe in that fraternity, and it might be worth blending that through some of our discussions this evening. But thanks again for inviting me.
Yeah, this is really interesting because I think you're right, actually. I was reflecting as you said that some of the things that you said, like care and about fraternity, and we need to find a non-gendered, but Nasrine, I take the point that we live in a very imbalanced world, and so we have to be uncomfortably happy with these words. And they seem to thread through everything. And so maybe actually we just pick up with Nasrine's list in the order which I have them, which is the specificity of schools. And the school obviously as a collection of people, not a place and not a brand name, but a group of people who are gathered together in the pursuit of knowledge. And that is really interesting. I mean, I speak to you obviously as a white man representing a school that's majority non-white. And I've done most of my learning over the last 5 years in Kingston from incredible, and in particular, incredible female students and staff in Kingston, kind of opening my mind and my understanding of the nature of the pressures that shape their world and the necessary steps that come to inclusion, which is a complicated thing because inclusion's become a kind of a buzzword, but actually what we're talking about is genuinely situated practice in the sense that there is no gap between the student and the discipline of architecture. There is no reservation about understanding that the currents that they are in, that the spaces and the experiences that have shaped them spatially before architecture, that those have their place in the discipline. And I guess that gap is particularly evident to people who feel excluded or underprivileged. Even though I'm, from, you could argue, a middle-class background, I felt that keenly in an architecture school that was very supportive, but I still felt this gap between me and the subject that really didn't close until I did the PhD. And I find that closing of the gap a kind of curricular concern. It's kind of a student concern. So the specificity of Kingston is one where we were having a debate recently, Mark, and to pick up that conversation about history, we were curious about the architectural historian in a school of architecture. And we did have a conversation about what if there wasn't one? And what if there was supporting armatures for the story of history that would allow stories to be told as multiple narratives and not to be linear and not to be exclusionary and not to be canonical. And it came out actually from one of my colleagues that she suggested it might be a temporary event that you would do this to allow the canon to be augmented and to be fully inhabited as something. And she made a really interesting conversation, which is that we're doing course design, and she said, we should get rid of any of the prefixes. So no vernacular architecture, no socially enabled architecture, no activist architecture, that everything's architecture. And we try and redefine the term in the broad sense by which it might have been initially encapsulated. So that's the specificity of Kingston. They're the things that we're dealing with. And my lived experience of that is one that I'm learning through colleagues and students as opposed to my own, Nasrine, when you were talking about specificity, was that the kind of thing you were eager to hear about? Was the specificity of our experience, or did you want to speak more generally about the world of schools? I mean, you've taught in many places and to great distinction.
Yeah, I think, the one thing which is, if we talk about specificity, the reason that I'm interested in it is also because of the fact that we tend, as I said, we tend to sort of talk about, we say architecture schools, and then we talk about the curriculum in architecture schools, we talk about the teaching of history or theory or construction and technology in architecture schools. But I do believe in the cultural relationship of these places, both the place, the where, and the whys of things become very important in a way. So a school of architecture that has the same program of history and theory, urbanism, history of urbanism, and now I'm sort of wavering into curriculum, studio teaching, electives. When you are in a when you're talking about history and theory with the canons that we have in the West, and when you're working with that in Asia, then the comprehension is totally different. So in one place, it becomes learning by memorizing. In the other place, it is the root and the racine, or the roots of where things are. So I think that these are the specificities that I'm talking about. So curricula, the curriculum of the school, I would fight for that specificity to be there. For instance, the relationship that one builds with a laboratory that deals with research and also teaching of a studio, but also the history of technology in a country whereby robotics has a very different sort of place in fabrication than a country that has only not a theoretical, but a very abstract relationship to robotics, makes the sort of the core of the curriculum to be something very different. So if you think of, I mean, it reminds me of this fantastic film of Harun Farokhi on the sort of the fabrication of brick, which basically, if we go into comparison is extremely, the film is called In Comparison, in fact. It's a fantastic film because it shows us that brick, a millennial sort of material that everybody calls it brick, and it is construction. It's a material for construction. The way that it is fabricated in Africa, as opposed to the way that it is fabricated in Switzerland. And that's where it becomes quite interesting to look at, for instance, what does it mean to fabricate with robots and robotics at ETH, as opposed to Hong Kong U, as opposed to UCD, as opposed to the AA, you know, for that matter. So all of a sudden, the relationship of the history of technology in these places changes. And that's where I think that I'm pleading for schools of architecture, or at least those places that I'm involved with, to really look at the specificity of the environment and the cultural. Now that doesn't bring us to a Framptonian sort of idea of regional specificity, but I'm talking about specificity in terms of how the question of labor in practice, there are many questions that come into it, and therefore the curriculum of a school of art needs to be a little bit different, I think, than a curriculum of a school of architecture, which is embedded in engineering, for instance. You know, now we can question all of those, but we also have to question the autonomy of architecture and its relationship, because I really believe, and this is maybe going a little bit outside of this line, but I do believe that architecture is very much of a dominated profession, and therefore, as it is a dominated profession, but also a dominated discipline, because they're two different things, I do believe that its relationships needs somehow to be re-questioned in this part of the century. So I'll just leave the line to come to Mark a little bit, so that we can really turn this into a discussion, as opposed to each of us saying something about, you know, whatever.
Certainly, there's a question around the absence or presence of an architectural historian, or why architectural historians had special place in an architecture school, and why that might be changing. The relationship of history and theory curriculum to a series of units, which are discrete and have their own history and theory elements that are contained within, and the relationship between what we'll call core studies, right, or complementary studies, that brings in history and theory, technical studies, media studies, into worlds that both support and are autonomous to units or studio-based education. And you can't really get around it. We have to kind of contend with the dominance of a unit or a studio-based education and how the rest of the curriculum is mapped. But every time we have to talk to ARB and RIBA, every time a validation comes around, we realized how many parts of the criteria are met with courses outside the unit and the importance of those other courses. And lately, I've been really dwelling in, I think units actually are quite wonderful and need light touch management and need space to experiment. But core studies, my goodness, if we have that right, so much of what we're trying to do with benchmarks, with criteria. The thing I've found only recently is that the level of experimentation is actually contained also within core studies, that these are not, we refer to them as the backbone of the curriculum, but actually I think they're just as nimble and dexterous as a unit might be. And I'm always surprised by the proposals sent forward from history tutors, from technical studies tutors, actually putting us out there and stretching us. So the balance between a kind of conversation around units and the rest of the curriculum might be a really healthy thing tonight as we look there. Andrew, over to you.
No, that's, I'm just a kind of, and I think we can start garrulously cutting in and disagreeing, can't we? I mean, I think that's what Nasrine was saying, but I think that is interesting. I mean, I'll tell you where we've got to, because our resource allocation is different in Kingston, obviously, from the AA, is we have been debating, because we're unitized from second year up in vertical structures, not dissimilar to the AA. And what we have been talking about, which is to produce a genuinely open and pluralistic reading of the histories of architecture, is that we're setting up a channel which will run every morning between 9:30 and 10:30, and every single day there will be a lecture on a building or on a history of architecture told by a member of our teaching team, right? So you use your unit system as a distributed field and you add one task to them in the year, which is to deliver a lecture. And what that does then is it opens up not a fully pluralistic reading of a canon, but the reading of a canon that might reflect the school. And so that becomes an augmentation of, and that comes out of COVID actually, Mark, as an innovation that we simply wouldn't have considered before. And actually a lecture to 12 students who turn up because they want to hear about a particular type of North African modernism is much more valuable than that student enduring in a room of 50 a lecture on Georgian architecture that means nothing to them being from Morocco. And so that is something that we're excited about. And then in the context of technology and fashion and making, I mean, I think I understand what you're talking about, Nasrine, in terms of robotics. I mean, those things, the workshop as a situated discipline is really intriguing. I mean, it's not something that we have in Kingston, but we're doing some work for NCAD in Dublin, and I do like the way they work. They have distributed workshops, and then they are able to give lectures and design tutorials in the workshops. And what happens is that the workshop and the studio become sort of analogous to one another. They become interrelated in a way that seems very fecund, because to separate them feels somehow alienating. And maybe that's what you meant about technology, is how do we interweave these things together? How do these things become genuinely explorative territories for our students, right? Is that what you were?
Yeah, I mean, it's that, but it's also, I think that in my mind, it's a very simple thing, is that fabrication in China is a very different thing than fabrication in Switzerland. We have to now, in architecture schools, create a situation whereby our students understand that labor costs are very different things. So just because of the fact that we make a form doesn't guarantee its construction in a specific place and a time to be. So this universalism is gone, it's finished. We have, but we are through the sort of the common line curricula that we are sort of remaking and going about. We're still staying within this idea of the master architect, and even though the master architect is gone by since long time ago. So even though we have these collectives and we have all sorts of different ways of practice that we have, we still are, architecture is still bound to a series of very, very hard line sort of generic models of teaching and learning. And I do think that this needs to be, and I'm talking generally, I'm not talking about right now about UCD or any specific school, but I'm just saying that it very much is the time to explode all of these, in fact. And therefore, when Wang Shu creates 25,000 beams made by hand in China, its implication as an architectural decision is a very different thing than when Garamazio in ETH creates 2,000 bricks in order to create a wall. And what I'm saying is that those are the places that we need to be specific, not in terms of teaching it, but bringing our students to that position that they are interested in finding that out. And it goes for what you're saying about history. I think that history is extremely important, especially this day and age. Now, how we teach it is a different thing. And one of the things that we did a long time ago, maybe in 2006, 7, if my memory comes back, at the Academy of Fine Arts, was in fact to create a series of triptychal platforms, which one of them was history, theory, and criticism, and it was a design platform. It's a design platform that actually has a historian who has studied architecture, has the autonomy of teaching history as a course, but also brings it into the design studio. Then methodology changes, because to teach history through a design studio is a very different thing than if you actually teach it through courses in a lecture hall. So, you know, I think that those are the places that we really need to we really need to insist to to just turn the page. And turning the page, I mean, we're all doing it in different ways. You're doing it at Kingston. I'm sure that the AA has changed from the time I went to the AA. It's not, I'm sure, I know that it has. I know that one thing that the AA has had, and that's probably the one thing that I can never, ever, I have never, ever seen anywhere else probably. And it's very difficult to try and instill it, but that's also the fraternity that I have with my own school, is that it had the capacity of instilling in us this everlasting desire to find things about architecture. So we can do that with history, we can do that with construction. And I think that it's more important for us to instill that in our students as opposed to teach them how to look at history. So, and I think that the university deals with this in a very, very different way. And I think sometimes it becomes problematic when it is the situation of the university, because of what you were mentioning earlier on, maybe in one of your emails to me, that, you know, how do we grade students? I mean, you know, it's not that the AA only is the place that has pass-fail, but university cannot deal with it, because not only university cannot deal with it, the students cannot deal with it anymore, because the student that asks for a fellowship in such and such a place needs to have a pass, which is a little bit incrementally more than a pass of another student. Otherwise, they won't get into it. So we can't bring all of this back and change it forever. So what are the things that we can change, and what are the things that we can allow to become agents of change in order for them to be the generator of new conditions and the generator of new conventions is extremely important. We are in the conventions right now, and I'm pleading, and I'm sure that you are in your own school, and that's why at UCD, what we did this semester, it's a very difficult thing. I don't know if anybody's there. I know I saw my boss, Hugh, there some time ago, but we have done something very difficult. And I think that for all of the teachers to pitch in to one program, to one year, one topic, not only the topic of reuse, but the word not just reuse, everything, redesign, redesign the curriculum, re-curriculum through an agent which we have taken, which is the General Post Office and O'Connell Street in Dublin, and the fact that we have vertical studios now, that is from first year, second year, third year, fourth year, which is giving a lot of difficulty to a lot of people, but also to the fellows, to the design fellows, but to also the teachers, because they have to teach first year, second year, third year, fourth year. So there's a break in that. Why are we doing that? It's because of the fact that we are seriously wanting to question our curriculum. It's because we want to seriously question how we're teaching, because we want to seriously, and maybe at the end of the day, we're going to actually come up to the conclusion that no, we should just go on with the conventions that we have in our schools. But you know, I think those are the things that in architecture schools we have the capability and possibility of doing as a collective in the schools.
Yeah, I have to say, pass-fail has been an interesting experience, because it's actually sort of liberating. A pass-fail system gives every student the opportunity to take risks without much fear, even risks to the point of failure. So it's there. I'll guard it with my life now that I've come to appreciate it. Recently, the Architectural Association had taught degree awarding powers granted by the Privy Council. And technically, we could make pass-fail operate across our postgraduate studies if we would like. But for so long, the postgraduate programs have operated in a different way. They're not quite ready. I think we should. I think there's something maybe specific to architecture where pass-fail is where we want to be. And it's not about subtle gradation. It's not about getting the brass ring. It's about doing it or not, and allowing things to become a little messy at the fringes. With honors projects, something else happens. So as much as you have a pass-fail, you can have honors, and that's a place where you would think there would be a lot of territoriality and competition. Not so. Because honors projects are so few and far between, everyone rallies, everyone's interested, everyone shows up for those presentations of the long list, everyone supports the students nominated for honors. It's a beautiful thing. And I think it connects back to pass-fail. If there wasn't just a pass-fail culture, I don't know if the honors culture would be the same at the AA. But I want to talk a little bit about the unit, because coming from, both Nasrine and I coming from Cornell, we're used to an academic year containing 2 complete studio experiences, semester experiences, and producing 2 projects. But certainly the depth of a 9-month project, that one that sits in a unit, one that then links up to other courses, what I'm calling core studies, has a certain depth and a level of seriousness and an ability to communicate to external examiners and end of year tables in a way that wouldn't be possible with a semester project. But that is a commitment. And Andrew was talking about in our pre-meeting, if that goes wrong, if you end up in the wrong unit, or if the unit goes off-piste, that's a long commitment and it can have impacts, right? So there's 2 sides of the unit coin, I would say. If it's working well, and if unit selection as a procedure works well and places you competitively and democratically into the place you need to be, there's nothing better. If there's a problem or a glitch, or if you make the wrong decision, you sit with that for a year and it impacts your confidence or portfolio and your next decision. So it's not to say that there isn't some risk involved with any of these kind of curricular models we're discussing. It's what is the value of it when it's working well versus this high stakes if it doesn't. But maybe Andrew, you were saying that was from personal experience. Maybe you could share.
Oh, I fear I would mention things that maybe I can't. I had a very, very problematic final year for reasons that were to do with just interpersonal relationships, inappropriate things happening in the unit. But that's not the issue. It made me very, and that was not democratic. It was a unit I hadn't chosen. I was just assigned to. And what was interesting there about Nasrine was talking earlier about the democratization of education. And sometimes that is presented as an illusion of choice. I mean, I've gone to schools in the UK where they're unitized, and it's done as a kind of artifice of criticality. And actually, they don't have meaningful positions, unalike positions, to actually meaningfully generate a unit system. And what you actually get is a kind of competition of really problematic and underbaked ideas being driven through students who are looking for their place in the discipline. And so I don't want to be too forcefully critical about it, except it's something that I've observed. And then I've equally seen amazing things happen in year systems and not great things happen in year systems. And I think where I'm going to, and I think we all are, is back to that question of people. I mean, we can reinvent structures of education. We can tear them up and we can cut the cake whichever way we want. But the truth of it is that there are still master atelier unit systems that produce work that looks like the work of the atelier master, which is, it seems like something from 100 years ago. And to go to the point that you raised about pass-fail and about risk, like the fundamental thing that a student has to get acquainted with in architecture school is a comfort with uncertainty and doubt and contingency and the ability to motivate yourself to work regardless, and that free exploration that Nasrine is talking about. That involves a particular type of teacher that is prepared not to know what they're looking at when they see it, and is prepared to go on a journey with their students. And that level of empathy is not equally distributed. But if we take it that it's a possibility and that it's a generic possibility in our schools, then it's an amazing thing. And what it actually starts to do is open up something which I think speaks very meaningfully about the nature of practice, because ultimately for these students, they will have lives outside of these schools, they will have career trajectories, they don't shoot out like a bullet from a gun, they navigate the world in their own way, and they need key skills to engage with that. But there does seem to be a link between the fractured landscape of pluralistic units and what I see as the fractured landscape of practice, specific to its site, as Nasrine's talking about. And there are certain types of practice that are now only sustainable by connections with universities. And they tend to be the ones that are sort of advancing the discipline. And sometimes that becomes a kind of a slightly snooty thing, you know, which is that it's only possible because you're grounded in a school. But yet, recurrently, architecture is informed and reinformed from those kinds of moments, sometimes from quite peripheral conditions. And maybe this is sort of the territory of research, Nasrine, that you were talking about, because that is new knowledge, that has a rigorous process, that it advances the discipline. Now, it's not something that lots of universities, say in the States particularly, are comfortable with classifying as research, but increasingly artistic research or practice situated research is understood as having knowledge and rigor to it. And actually, I would take a slightly different tack to, say, design-based research, where that seems to be something abstracted and removed from the world, whereas practice-situated research seems to be about engaging with the world and producing some knowledge in that context. And where I'm coming back to Mark's point about doubt and risk is that risk is at the heart of that. And then a self-reflective process that allows you to see in that process, I think, is kind of recurrently part of that. And I think there's a whole landscape of architecture long after they've left universities that enjoy connection with those processes and require connection with those processes. And the only places that do them are schools of architecture, weirdly. Awards juries don't do it. The critic is pretty much, as far as I can tell, dead as a kind of meaningful figure shaping the discipline. So where does that criticality reside? I think it has to be in the schools. I can't see anywhere else that does it. And where that opens up landscapes for research or funding, Nasrine, I'm not sure if that's a helpful contribution, but it does seem to me like the direction of travel, this ecosystem of marginal or critical practices generating work with students in a self-reflective process that has disseminated outputs that actually is shaping the world of practice. I can't see any other way that that can be sustained without it becoming iconographic kind of object buildings. Do you know what I mean? Am I just making a word salad here?
No. I think there are certain things that interest me very much in what you're saying. And one of them is, we're talking about some research-based practices in universities. Now, in fact, it's a funny thing because it was one of the when I was running for the deanship at Hong Kong U in 2012, one of the 5 sort of things that I was bringing into the discussion when you have to give these lectures and whatever was to say that the future of practice is going to be in the university. And that would basically mean that you would allow the research, teaching, and practice in architecture, I'm not talking about other stuff, but in architecture, to be superimposed and have different scales of operation within a place where they don't have to only respond to the client as the person that pays, and therefore we do. So you obliterate, you take away this problem of architecture as a service. Now, there are, of course, there are always going to be offices that are going to deal with that as architecture as service in other places, but at least one part of the practice would actually become this this other alternative to the way that one practices. Now, there are various models of this. Hong Kong U has one, Chinese University has, Hong Kong has one, Tsinghua has one office of research and architecture practice. But then again, we go back to that question of specificity. They're very different. Some of them are basically offices of practice nested into the university. The university being public, it's for all the public commissions. So, but then again, in Europe, it's a very difficult thing if one wants to do something like that, because and I don't know, I don't have any I may be just a little bit of a dinosaur in this, but I don't really have any examples of that. I do have examples of offices that are doing fantastic research work, like Auteur in Belgium, but they are not, as far as I know, their work is not, as far as I know, nested in the university. However, they have very, very close collaborations with a variety of places that they're working with, whether it's Harvard as fellows or postdocs, or whether it is in Belgium itself or as lecturers, but they're not nested in a university. However, it's a very interesting model because it could allow for architecture to go to a different trajectory. That architecture deals with, when it's in the university, it deals with speculation. It deals with a series of speculative questions, which then can go out of the university and become practice as something that is actually the concrete form of that speculation. However, it needs a very careful and precise relationship with which practices do you actually create these alliances. The same way that in my days, we had alliances at the AA with OVARP, but we never had engineers that were actually teaching technology in those days. We had to learn how to talk about our projects to OVARP engineers for half an hour or 25 minutes, because that's all that they would afford us. Now, today, how do we teach technology? We keep on bringing engineers and people that are actually in our schools to do a module of technology. So I think that these are the questions that really interest me in terms of what you're saying, in terms of the relationship that practice could have within the university as a research base, but then that research at some point within the framework of architecture is going to become something which is going to have a physicality. It's going to have a form, it's going to be spatial, and it's going to be something which is going to be there, whether it's at the scale of a territory or it's at the scale of an object, or it's a scale of a museum. So how and where does one cut the line of research to the practice is a fundamental question that we need to ask ourselves today. And how can we do that? I'm sure that we can design it.
Oh, I think we can, but I think that, I mean, it's interesting because you've covered a decent territory there. I mean, I was thinking as you spoke about, obviously, the ARU in London Met with Florian and Philip working under Robert Mull, and even Robert Mull's free unit, and the way it was engaging with, global migrant, the global migration crisis and refugee crisis. And actually there's a practice situated in that space that isn't possible anywhere else. Or even, in a very, not mundane at all, a really beautiful way in Kingston, Takeshi Hiyatsu has basically built a unit that's half in the university and half in the local community and builds real projects for the local community. And I mean, I know the story of the latter one really because it's a unit that is really strong, but needed protection and needed space because student experience in a live build context isn't always the most, thumbs up, top of the NSS rating for you. These things are contested. And then it gets moving and get rolling. And part of that is the school as not basically an incubator, but I do think giving space and trust where it's required. I'll hand over to Mark, but there was a slide that Tom Emerson put up recently, provocatively. The institution is scared above all else of angry students. And I thought that was really interesting because it's true. But students, if they understand the educational landscape, they understand the trajectory, and there is a space where they are allowed into that, they don't get angry. They might get frustrated, but the university tends to not allow those things bubble up to the point that they're fully formed.
Mm.
Angry students are all right.
They are.
I take meetings with the registrar at the AA, Belinda Flaherty, an institution herself, most every Monday morning. And sometimes it's like this, it's 6 or 7 show up, but we're there to listen before anything bubbles up, before anything gets angry. There are concerns, there are issues, there's miscommunication, there's doubt, there's questions. Keeping a communication line open is essential. This was particularly important over the last year and a half. It remains so. Nothing they've ever asked has been off topic. It's really been helpful. And in fact, it's been empowering. If you take the time to meet with those students weekly, the same hour, the same day, you have a kind of crib sheet for what you need to do and prioritize for the rest of the week. So it's kept me quite honest, actually. And I suppose every school makes a certain space for that feedback loop. It was useful over COVID that it was online. And now that we're back face to face, this kind of fracture, who wants to be online, who wants to be in a room together? It's a bit messy again, but there's something about it's communication. It's not down to emails or posters or a great website. Sometimes it's literally about open doors that everyone can count on week to week. But it's actually been the superpower in my world to take those meetings, hear what's happening before it becomes an issue, and head it off at the pass, or understand that there's a problem brewing that really will need a reckoning. But that's something that's occurred over the last 2 years, forced by COVID, but now a part of our everyday. So I'm kind of thankful for it. I wouldn't have done that in the past, but now that it's been established, now it's the norm. But it's kept us very honest. It's also helped, and I don't know how it is at your respective schools, that we have student representatives on every committee now. This has changed the culture of the school dramatically. Even one student rep on a teaching and learning committee or an academic committee or an academic board, I think has been always to the benefit of that committee. So I don't know where different institutions are in that, but the AA might have been late to the party in having student reps, but now that we have them, I can't imagine another world. It has kept us honest, it has kept us timely, and it's given us a sense of our marching orders. So it's not to say, and I think, Andrew, you brought up this kind of service industry question mark. I really want to say that an architecture school is not a service industry, nor is architecture. And yet we can have other discussions around it. But I'd like to think that the participation of student representatives and the democracy it enables is one of the abiding strengths, actually, of a school as opposed to a practice.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, I'm not responsible for this infrastructure. It's been created by the team, both inside and outside, but we have similar, student representatives, multiple on all committees. We have an inclusive curriculum committee, which is students from outside architecture and within who review our briefs, who review our course design and work with us to do that. We have events like, we just did the vertical project, which is first years all the way to fifth years working together, and they proposed redesigns of our teaching methods. And that was really interesting in that we got 40 submissions and 2/3 of them asking for more group work, for more connection with the fundamentals of construction, of real material conditions local to the school. And I found that very interesting. And those are things that we continually use. And I think the thing that we've used that I found most valuable is this mentorship network that we've set up from master's level students with first years and second years, and you get a mentor and you mentee relationship, and you develop this thing over time. Not responsible for any of this other than I support it, but those things work extraordinarily well, particularly the latter, because you get this infrastructure of care working in terms of opening the doors of the institution and giving you the back channel, the inside gossip, if you like, on the school as they go through the school in a way that you get it anyway, you navigate it anyway, but particularly for students from more marginal backgrounds who might feel excluded, it really has transformed their ability to engage and to hang on in the course and to move forward in the course. And it all feels like curriculum to me. I mean, I know these are pastoral care, but I think this seems like a curriculum conversation. It's the curriculum as designed by the students as a live connection with their experience, not as it's going to shape everything that we do, but because, as you say, it really helps you see your blind spots and see around corners you didn't really even know were there. Sorry. I was apologizing because I went on too long. I'm also conscious that we've got a lot of really good people in the audience. It's a small audience, so this is more like a chat in the pub, really, as Mark was saying. And I'm eager that we hear from people if they wanted to talk about things. I mean, rather than, we had certain areas we wanted to cover. I think we're sort of gone through most of those. If people wanted to say things, please do.
I'll go on.
Very quiet.
We're on the pub, yeah.
We're on the
very quiet audience.
Well, 180 seconds, Nasrine, is what the students tell me I have to leave, and they will spontaneously fill that gap. But I hate
180 seconds.
Yeah, you've got to wait.
That's forever, Andrew.
What?
That's forever.
I know. Can you imagine how badly I handle that? But anyway, what I'm going to say is people just hop in if you want to. Oh, Grania, I think, did you want to come in?
There's somebody.
Sorry, Frank is making Hugh and Grania co-host in an effort, I suppose, and Kevin and others to just spontaneously chat with us. I mean, I think this question though about the student experience is one that I find it's very interesting how those experiences you have in your university years come so vividly alive when you recall them. And so this care or this attitude to how we engage with that process, understanding that it encompasses discomfort for the student at times, is such a vital thing. I think it's the only thing at times, because it is the thing whereby things can snowball, and no matter how carefully structured your curriculum is, no matter how lofty your research goals, it's not going to happen unless you have eyes on the ground.
You know, there's one thing though that I was thinking about this earlier on, and I think that it's probably a sort of a, for me, it's definitely a huge problem in terms of the comparison of, 20 years ago and architecture schools and today. It's not so much just climate change and what the students are being bombarded with a lot of information that they can handle through whatever social media. However, architecture is quintessentially a projective act, and they're learning in schools to project. But it's very disconcerting to see that they cannot. In society, they're constantly being stopped from projecting because climate change, are veering toward extreme right situations. There is no projection in life. I can't, you know, there are lots of people that are by nature optimistic, but if I was in their generation, if I was a student today, I would be scared so much in terms of what's going to happen in 20 years' time, because of the way that the society is actually dealing with that. So I think that there is something to be had, to be sort of to be discussed, not only amongst ourselves, but also with our students, not to give them fake hope, but to bring them to understand that that has almost forever been the predicament of architecture.
I completely agree, Nasrine.
You know, I'm not optimistic at all. I don't even know in 20 years' time if we're going to be able to breathe, you know, but still, I think that we need to bring that predicament to a projective, because a project is an intention, and we are dealing with projects every day. And this intention needs to have a future, needs to have a time in front of it. And it's a real big problem right now for our students, because they are constantly bombarded by the fact that there is no future.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And it's a good topic you're opening up here, Nasrine. This will be the bit everybody just skips to. I mean, I think one of the things I've noticed is the amount of performative despair that is carried out by academics in particular, who don't, and I don't say that as a negative, in the sense that they feel keenly the urgency of the situation, and then there is this sort of performative display of just how moved they are by it, by an argumentation. And that's sort of what I went back to at the start when I was saying anger is born from care. But we have to find a way of making that into a generous and optimistic act, because fundamentally care desires for that to be. And I completely agree with everything you've just said, that yes, these things are existential questions. Although we were having a really interesting conversation with my unit yesterday, and one asked, is this any different to how people felt during the Cuban Missile Crisis? And then she was actually saying, no, they probably felt it a lot worse and a lot more keenly. And so that the actual nature of existential questions over humanity, or about the discipline even, those things are things that abide. And one of the things that I'm finding really interesting as a technique is that you open up questions of architectural language as a way of solving it, because you observe that, look, if architecture is to change so dramatically, then it is about looking at that thing and not rejecting things like aesthetics, not rejecting things like care and assembly, but being keen about what are the languages of the future, not based on materiality or form, but on the necessary thinking about assembly and disassembly, and not just that process as being venerated, but just going, actually, you can make an aesthetic here. You can make aesthetic judgments. We do have space for a cultural and a critical conversation while talking about beauty. We can talk as architects about poetry and care about the climate crisis. I'll stop because I know, Mark, you want to come in on that, do you?
Oh my goodness. Nasrine touched a nerve. Look, at the last Physio tables, I sat down to what was supposed to be an amazing day of portfolio review. And the first student said, my project doesn't offer answers, it only asks questions. And I thought, well, that's novel, that's fantastic, I'm ready for that. That went well. And then the next student stood up and said the same thing. And then the next student stood up and said the same thing all day. Suddenly, there were no answers. There were no sort of architectural proposals, a series of hand-wringing questions, well communicated. And I was unnerved. And I think I might have missed the boat, that we were headed there, but I was shocked by the end of the day. And I think we're having conversations about where is architecture's responsibility or the future path.
I have 5 minutes. I have to ask a question.
Oh, sorry. Kevin, you want to come in?
Go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't realize I was unmuted, so I'll let the conversation go for a second and then come in when.
No, I think that was really good. I really like that, Kevin.
This is real time. We prefer it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well then it would be courteous of me to put my video on as well, probably. Would it?
Oh yeah, it's always good to see you, Kevin.
There we go. Hi, Andrew. Hi, everybody, and sorry for interrupting, and thank you for a really interesting conversation. It's been really kind of fascinating to be in the room and to hear the thoughts come and go. I suppose just on it's kind of slightly related to climate, I suppose, which I think is interesting in that it's not so much a new thing that's added to the curriculum as a lens through which to review your life. So as a kind of an existential issue, it's so global that the ways in which it changes the curriculum, they kind of filter down through people's experience and so on. But one of the difficulties I suppose I see in architecture school now is the proliferation of elements of the curriculum outwards. So we're asking students to do more and more. And as architects, often we're reluctant to leave things behind as we ask the students to do more and more. And one of the best things I think we can probably offer students is kind of direction in how to make choice in all of that, to see what's on offer to them and not feel obliged or be obliged within the program to take on everything. And I know that it's a question of resources and a question of structuring and all that kind of thing. But if there are ways of structuring courses to allow students to understand how to find their own path through the course without having to do everything, which I suppose is the traditional way of going through architecture school, to be taught the kind of the master system that was referred to elsewhere, I think that would lead to a very, or potentially to a positive future for architectural education.
Yeah, I agree. I actually think it's linked to what Mark was in the middle of talking about in an interesting way. When you're scared of declaring, when the context, the critical context within which you're operating asks you not to declare, because as soon as you declare one way or the other through proposition or through artifact that you can have a Studs high flying tackle that takes you down, then the maneuver is to move to interrogation. And as Mark says, that's a kind of self-defeating, self-eating process. But what I have noticed in that context is that inability to resolve or to declare produces a profusion of production, which is deleterious and not required in the sense of some of it might be, but the critical skills that might occur, and this sounds lofty, but the conversation in the pub, actually, the kind of conversation that we're having right now with the project on the board behind you is the thing you need to do on the Wednesday, as opposed to sitting in the robotics lab, crafting something. And I think that isn't given enough space to. It's something that I'd like to hear from more people about. I mean, one thing that I've talked about to our students is we say, if you give us 35 productive hours a week, you'll probably pass. That's fine. And that you need to think about it in those terms. And that any time you give beyond that is you have asked of yourself to give, and you're doing it for reasons of your education, and you're doing it for reasons of your self-advancement. And we do that because the vast majority of our students have jobs to support their finances in Kingston in education. And actually, it doesn't always work, but it does produce a conversation whereby time is valued. And then we hope, and it's one of the things that I regret about my own education, is that when I left school, I was completely unable to articulate my value monetarily to the world. I was completely disempowered to ask questions in terms of salary. It's not the fault of the school, but I do think that those things in terms of livelihood, and we have to remember people earn a living from this subject, that kind of frenetic production and the time having no value is a really, really insidious poison if it's not at least pointed at. And of course, students can still do it, and we all do it. We're up late talking about architecture here because we enjoy it. But it is to talk about it at least, or at least to point the finger at it. I don't know if that solves the question you're asking, and maybe Nasrine and Mark, I should stop talking and let you guys come in.
I don't know if it's a question, but Kevin is asking, but no, I don't know. I don't have my head right. Maybe I'll give my I pass so that Mark can come into this. I'm just trying to put a couple of ideas together on what Kevin was saying, but then maybe after in 3 minutes.
Well, it cuts to the underbelly, really, of what we're doing day to day. I also think there's this question of expertise, which keeps coming up related to your question. Where do you invest? Where are people meant to have a general education? And when are they meant to, through unit selection and through other sort of algorithmic choices, become expert in anything? I think architecture has traditionally been a very permissive education. If not a promiscuous education, it can jump into philosophy, poetry, it can go into engineering, it can talk about anything it wants. It's this kind of secret amongst students that as much as your parents have asked you to focus, architecture actually allows you to be very broad. And there's something fantastic about that. And I try to impress upon students who are always nervous about unit selection. Your choice doesn't end with the unit. Your choice actually ends with all the other things you're adding into it and how you respond to the unit, how you respond to a brief. It's a lot to ask of a second-year student to take on that mantle. It's easy to ask of a fourth or fifth-year student in diploma level to do so. If I had any critique of my own school, the juncture between first year and second year is a chasm. And there's something I wish I could fix about that, because I think all the discussion about choice, about democracy, about, well, connection to pet interests, they're hardly developed by the end of first year. First year is so much about skilling and about an introduction to history and theory, to technical studies, media studies, that I take special interest in second year students. I know they're at the most risk. So yeah, I think it links back to your question to acknowledge that the gradation is odd. And the idea of a vertical unit, one that clusters 2 years together, whether it's second and third or fourth and fifth, is an innovation that demands certain things of first year. If I were to give acknowledgement or raises or boxes of champagne to anyone, I would give it to first year tutors, because I think they make everything else happen. And students meet that challenge really well. I think they're energized to do so. But it's a kind of compromise. I think to take the first year of an education, throw it into skilling, throw it into making a portfolio that communicates, and then imagine from that point forward, you're more or less a free agent, completely competent to take decisions about every part of your education, is a bit of a kind of fable. And I would like to imagine, and I think in the States, decisions around where you locate in a studio in your second or third year are more controlled. It completely makes sense to me that by the time you're in your fourth or fifth year, you have scope, you have responsibility to your own future, that you can take those decisions. I'd love to talk about the predicament of a second year student, at Kingston. How does that work, Andrew? Do students have that much at stake?
Yeah, but we're adjusting things actually out of some of the things that we've learned from you guys. One is that we switch from a year structure based on assigned groupings of tutors in the second semester to ones where they rotate on a project basis, first by lottery, then by selection. And then we have 2 blocks of block teaching, which are year structures when they come into second year, where in our new revised curriculum, it's a module called Architecture is Made in Play. And it's a completely free, and by play, we mean a non-hierarchical body-mind relationship. And it's effectively tectonics and representation, but in a very, very constructed brief that actually produces risk and experimentation that has been refined by Nick Lobo-Brennan. And that's really working at getting them into a unit structure in second year, which they then can work within and take risks within. And it's actually commonly talked about among our externals that second year is the strongest year in the school. And which is really interesting because it isn't vertical. Our second year units are second year only. And the level of risk taking and the level of inquiry as to the discipline, and that some of that dries up with the pressure of thesis in third year. And then masters is different because people are returning from practice, and yes, there's beautiful lyrical work, but it's burdened with more other concerns, whereas the freedom in second year is always remarkable at the end of the year. I find it opens so many doors for me and for the colleagues that are assessing it. So I don't know, Nasrine, do you want to come in on this?
Well, I'm a little bit sort of I'm a little embarrassed actually, because I'm at UCD for only one semester, so I can't really tell. I know what happens in second year and first year and third year and fourth year, but it would be difficult for me to say that this is what we do there. That's hence the structure that we put into place to ask ourselves the question: do we want progressivity from first year to fourth year, and eventually as a thesis? What does a thesis mean in fifth year anyway? You know, I mean, there are so many schools that everybody calls it a thesis or an end of year project or end of master's project, but it's very, very different the way that one deals with the structure of it. So right now, we are in a situation whereby we are trying to see whether we need to go into progressivity, or does a real sort of layered verticality with a series of horizontal progressions, can that be a new way of having this curriculum? So right now with the GPO project or the GPO Common project, what we have is that we have a series of investigation lines that we are cutting across with the verticality of the year. So year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4 in every studio. That means 16 studios that are double teaching, therefore 2 teachers for 16 students, 16 studios. And in that, we have the students of the first year that are supposed to be looking at building and the anatomy of the building, in this case, the GPO and O'Connell Street, its anatomy. What does it mean? What does anatomy mean in terms of a building? Therefore, it's materiality, it's its elements, it's its fragments, it's its pieces, it's its structures, etc., etc. Second year, it's still a sort of a kind of a progressive idea, because the second year is looking at the GPO as a machine, but also function. How do you deal with machine and function? In the third year, the line is to look at publicness and the idea of urban network. Therefore, you can see the progressivity from anatomy to urban network. And finally, the fourth year is dealing with the problem of system, the GPO as a system, because the GPO being our agent, and therefore how one deals with territorial connectivity in that context. Now, when a first year student doesn't have some skills, but has other skills, is basically much freer than a fourth year student or a third year even student, because a third year student is probably trying to get their bachelor's, therefore they're a little bit nervous. This combination of the vertical and the arrival of a series of investigation lines or corridors will create, and I'm really hoping for sort of a kind of a kind of a conclusion that we're going to come up to on the 7th week, and finally in the final at the end in December, October and then December, that it allows us to reflect upon the curriculum in a different way that we have so far. So, you know, that's
really
where we are. That's where we are. But, you know,
that's really interesting. I mean, what I'm conscious of, we probably need to wrap up, but one thing I just wanted to add to the discussion is that one thing that is coming out of, we're redesigning our courses completely at the moment. And one innovation which has come out of the whole work, which I think we'll write up and share, is, and I don't think it applies to the AA because you have this structure that works really well, but we used to have quite abstract modular titles that, you know, technical this and reading architecture, this kind of stuff. We've completely changed it now to what we call chapters. So you can start into first year and you can see the 16 chapters that will take you to the end of third year. And so the first chapter is called Architecture Starts with Seeing, and they move on to Architecture is for Others, etc., etc. Architecture is slow, architecture builds a human habitat, architecture is understood by each of us differently, etc. And it ends with a module, which is your final project, which is called This is Architecture for Me Right Now. And what we're trying to do with that is to, it sounds like a bit of a pure thing, but what we're trying to do actually is to genuinely tell a navigable story of key lessons in architecture that our specific school is looking to impart, and they become ways of looking at history combined, say, with tectonics or something. And we're hoping that it's going to take the pressure off the final project as a culminating thing. It's just the last chapter of a book that you've been reading for 3 years and that you can get to. Now, God knows will it work or not, but it is something we're kind of excited about as a way of telling the story of education and its curricular design in a way that's more clear than just being as it was before, design 1, 2, 3, etc. But maybe that's for another night.
definitely.
Yeah, I love chapters. I mean,
Hey.
we've been this morning following a trail of Ian Nairn through London, which is very much about chapters and very much about a kind of narrative. And maybe that's what we need to come back to, but it needs to be very different. And I suppose what you've done with this notion of chapters is opening it up quite broadly. But there's something quite sweet about Nairn's capacity to be humorous and hypercritical at the same moment. This has been the Bible of the course. It's sort of had a renaissance. I think he's arguing for the right things, but he's definitely of the moment, his moment, the 60s. But students are on board, and they're trying to find their own chapters and write their own interstitial chapters around Ian's London. But to talk about it in terms of chapters rather than required courses or a curriculum is a nice touch, Andrew. So I would support you in that. Ultimately, we are kind of asking students to weave a kind of story for themselves. And if they understand that the curriculum is organized as a series of chapters, and if it's down to them to choose the sequence of reading those chapters or the significance they attribute to them, they're empowered as well. So it's hats off to you, actually. I very much like the chapters.
Well, like all these things, Mark, I'm just a talking head taking responsibility for the work of, 60 incredible colleagues, etc. So don't pass on the praise to where it's due. But what we might do to close is to say, look, I really thoroughly enjoyed this. I mean, Mark, I know you a little bit, Nasrine, this is the first time meeting. I want to thank you for the generosity and sincerity of the conversation and the fraternity that it establishes. And maybe, Nasrine, you were talking about networks, but maybe there's a little incipient network here, and that we might find other occasions, perhaps in real pubs, to continue the conversation. And thanks so much to Frank and to everybody who listened to our rabble. I certainly learned a lot and enjoyed a lot. I hope our audience did as well. So I think it's up to me to press leave.
Thank you, Andrew. And it was nice meeting you, even though through this sort of screen of mine, and Mark as well. And thank you again for inviting us to talk about what we all share. And spend so much time thinking about it.
Yeah, drinks on me next time, Andrew. Fantastic evening. Thank you all. Thanks for everybody participating.
I'll hold you to
Thank
that.
you.
See you soon, guys. Take care. All the best. Bye now. Bye.
Thank you.